Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 2, Fledgling, Chapters 5 and 6. Let's begin. You lied to me, Sir Nighteye stated. He didn't slam his hands on the desk, or hiss, or engage in any other histrionics, no matter how badly he wanted to. Instead he fixed the commissioner with a bland stare. The man returned it, but the fact that he wasn't spluttering at the insult or otherwise taking offense told Mireille that the commission knew exactly what he was talking about. I didn't lie. Commissioner Sukin said mildly. I just didn't tell you. So what happened? Mireille demanded. Exactly how do you lose a headless corpse? He added the question. The commissioner snorted. We didn't. We never had it, he stated. That caused Sir Nighteye's blood to run cold, and he saw again in his mind's eye one of the images that had come to trouble him. The man had all for one's build, and seemingly all for one's multitude of quirks but covering his head, and a part of his chest was a black mask. The obvious conclusion was that it was him, except, he had been headless. No matter what quirks you had, there was no coming back from that. Not even regeneration quirks went that far, and Toshinori would have known if he had a regeneration quirk. Sukin sighed. First responders checked the body. There were no signs of life. They then grabbed All Might and got him treatment. The site was marked off, as you well know. Then when we sent the corpse collectors in, there was no body. Sir Nighteye shuddered. So his people got him? It would seem that way, the commissioner nodded. Mireille took several deep breaths to calm himself. I don't see why you are worried. All they have is a corpse. Maybe, he murmured. Realization dawned on the commissioner's face as he no doubt recalled what Sir Nighteye's quirk was. What have you seen? He demanded. All Might, without his quirk, fighting someone who could have been him. Could have been? The height was his, the build was his, the suit was his. As were the multiple quirks. However, there was a black metal mask covering his head and shoulders. The commissioner worried his lip as he thought. A clone perhaps? Or a puppet? He offered the alternatives. The thought of the figure being one of them had occurred to Sir Nighteye as well, but human cloning was illegal. It wouldn't stop All for One, came the immediate retort from his mind. He wouldn't allow himself to be cloned. That argument felt better to him. He is no longer calling the shots. The statement from the commissioner was enough for Mireille to know what they would be trying if they had All for One's body. They would be desperately trying to extract his quirk, and if that meant cloning the man, that's what they would do. They had blood, so they could still be attempting that. He made a mental note to truly check. The world did not need another All for One. Is not, but if there is anything of him, Sir Nighteye didn't finish. He didn't need to. The commissioner understood. Let's say the person in your vision was him. He could not be fully functional, Sukin said matter-of-factly. They pulled brain matter out from All Might's hand, so at the very least, he has a traumatic brain injury. Sir Nighteye ran through the rest of his visions. He'd done this already, but another check never hurt. Except, he could not find that man again. One battle was all he'd seen. He could look into Toshinori's future again and look further, but that was chancy. His visions were in real time. And even with All Might being on limited time, that was more events than he could observe in an hour. I'd feel a lot better, he didn't finish. He'd feel a lot better with a body and a cremation, but the commissioner wouldn't have allowed that. Even so, no matter what the commission had planned, he'd feel better with the body under their control. What have you told him? Commissioner Sukin asked, not bothering to fill in the half-sentence Mireille had uttered. I haven't, Sir Nighteye told him. He's already pushing himself. He does not need to know that All for One might have survived. Sukin nodded and Mireille frowned lightly as he recalled something else. You haven't gotten his assets? The commissioner was a consummate politician, but All Might's sidekick was watching for a reaction. The slight souring of his expression was enough to tell him everything he needed to know. He was slightly curious to know what had gone wrong, but not so much that he could ask. There were a number of things that might have happened, including All for One having proper paperwork to deal with his assets in case of death or misadventure. The man was arrogant enough to believe he wouldn't need those arrangements, but thorough enough in creating his alias to actually have them. It was almost like a posthumous stab at them. That would be like All for One. Mireille sighed audibly. I will not tell All Might, he told the commissioner. But in return, you will keep me apprised of anything that might be him. For a moment, he thought the commissioner might reject the deal. Then the man released his own sigh. The commission could not afford for the number one hero to be against them. They might control a lot, but All Might had enough popularity that he could go against them. That is acceptable, he replied. Sir Nighteye nodded and then rose and left. There was really nothing more to say. Garaki looked at the vial. It was clear and the liquid in it was clear. It was the latest batch of strengthening drugs he'd made for Sensei. The man had recovered, but he wanted more. More speed, more stamina, more strength. He didn't seem to understand that when you were injured that badly, just breathing should be considered a victory. Sensei understood that some things would take time and that he would get stronger as the years went on, but he was not content with that. He wanted everything now. Kyudai knew what Sensei wanted. He wanted to turn back the clock, or transfer to a new body, or something to bring him back to his prime. Getting old was not something the man accepted. Being feeble was definitely not something Sensei would tolerate. That's why Garaki was working on drug combinations to make him stronger. But these were powerful drugs and in combinations that weren't tested. It would be easier if Sensei would allow him to use that new drug, the one that activated quirks, but while that offered stunning possibilities, even Garaki could see dangers there. He didn't need the blood-freezing look the man had given him. He may not have eyes, but Sensei knew how to use his presence effectively. He just hoped this cocktail was effective. He was running out of combinations. Kurogiri looked down at the letter in his hand. It was on the letterhead of Hoin, Mori and Nishimura, signed by Watanabe and addressed to Hisashi Rigi. It had been forwarded, via several very roundabout ways to him from JBQC. It advised Hisashi that as the government considered him officially missing, he had 7 years from the date of his fight with All Might before they would be legally obligated to action his will. Sensei? He prompted. All for One seemed pensive once he read the letter. He nodded slowly to acknowledge that he'd heard. Forward them a payment from my personal account, he instructed. And, I believe I will send Izuku to speak to them before the time limit is up, if I cannot do so myself. The Misty Man nodded. That made sense. He already knew that Sensei was seeking other means of healing and All for One would not wish to appear so weakened, even to his lawyers. There was time before they had to act. We'll just have to make sure Inko does not visit them, Sensei murmured. At that, Kurogiri gave his boss a sharp look, even though he knew the man could not fully see it. Was Inko still a beneficiary? That could be difficult to solve. Do you? He didn't ask the full question. Did Sensei want his wife taken care of? No, he said immediately, waving one hand to dismiss the matter. I do not wish to deal with the inevitable investigation at the moment. Ah, that made sense. Inko's death, if it was anything but completely accidental, would likely attract attention and investigation, which would no doubt confuse those who knew her but would happen anyway. I will set a reminder, Kurogiri indicated. If it was getting close to the time limit, and Sensei was not healed, he would remind the man that something had to be done. Very well, All for One allowed and the matter was dismissed. While he couldn't see them in the traditional sense, All for One still liked to inspect the prototypes. It was genetically programmed into them that he was their master, but allowing them to see him reinforced that, so there were benefits to visiting even when he couldn't actually see the progress. This one is functional? He asked. Yes, the doctor said, though Hisashi detected a note of, what was it? Annoyance. The doctor was annoyed at something. Like the last one? All for One probed. Yes, Kyudai answered, apparently realizing his tone had been detected. All for One didn't turn towards him. He'd destroyed the last prototype, which had been both necessary and unnecessary. Necessary to work out his anger. Unnecessary because it did destroy valuable research. How independent is this one? It will fight, Garaki said, but it will need direction to be told who to fight, he added. Acceptable, All for One said. Can you make others more independent? These things were foot soldiers. They did not have to be completely able to think for themselves. There was meant to be someone who controlled them. I believe so, the doctor answered immediately. But I think it would be best done via fixation. Fixation? Yes. The higher cognitive functions of the human mind are destroyed by the action of multiple quirks. It's not that surprising. The body detects the second quirk and treats it as an infection. The body's temperature rises but the quirk does not leave, and so eventually the mind is compromised. While I can ameliorate the effects somewhat, I believe if the mind is fixated on something, A concept, an event, even an emotion, then that fixation will survive, and some cognitive function will be retained with the fixation. All for One gave the doctor a look. That's the theory, Garaki admitted. You may look for a suitable candidate to test it upon, Hisashi said. He saw the doctor nod. Gigantomachia, All for One called. His bodyguard moved, and from the slight flinch Kyudai gave, the doctor had forgotten that the huge man was there. My lord? This has been put off for too long. Take the prototype to Niigata. At the word Niigata, Gigantomachia's expression changed. He grinned, showing his teeth, and an unholy light lit in his eyes. I believe you know who needs to be collected, All for One said. I do, my lord, but the giant's expression altered. He seemed distinctly disappointed but resolved. I cannot leave you unguarded. Garaki saw All for One's expression and was controlled enough not to laugh, but it was a near thing. I will be safe enough here, Hisashi countered. Gigantomachia said nothing. All for One was meant to be safe at work too, but that had not happened. The giant man knew it wasn't his fault the heroes had found Hisashi, but he probably felt it was his fault that he was not on hand to protect him. All for One sighed, recognizing that Gigantomachia would not say anything but was going to continue to object. He sighed. I will have the doctor configure several prototypes for protection and have a comm to you with Kurogiri waiting, he offered. The huge man thought about that for a moment before he nodded, his smile once again turning predatory. I will bring them to you, he announced. No, I wish the prototype to take them. You are accompanying it as an observer. I wish to know how functional it is with simple instructions. If it cannot perform, then you will take over and bring both the targets and the prototype back. Gigantomachia listened carefully and then nodded. He flexed huge fingers. It will be done, my lord. All for One smiled. Kyudai didn't like it, but at least it wasn't directed towards him. Prepare. Hisashi paused for a moment. 2 tanks. I want to know what it takes to awaken a quirk, he instructed. Garaki nodded. Will there not be 3? He asked. There were 3 involved. 1 held back, Hisashi explained, so we'll form the base of a prototype instead. The doctor nodded as he understood. That was All for One's mercy. Prototypes lost their mind. It was perhaps a harsh mercy, but it was a mercy. If this test is successful, I believe they will then move from prototype to production. Do you have a name for them? All for One asked. Kyudai chuckled. To anyone unfamiliar with the prototypes, the main feature was their exposed brain. Except, for all that it was exposed, they did not truly think. Nonashi, he said the word. Brainless? Hisashi translated with a chuckle. The statement wasn't quite true since the prototypes obviously had brains, but he knew what the doctor was implying. Maybe they should be more literal? How about a contraction? No mind. Nomu, he gave the term. Nomu, Kyudai repeated the word, trying the word in his mouth. Yes, that fits, he decided. Start a production batch. Mixed abilities and quirks, but all with physical enhancement. Give them all regeneration and 1 or 2 other quirks, he instructed. How many? Let's start with 10 for the first batch. Hisashi couldn't see it, but he imagined that Kyudai's face was surprised. That will take a long time. The doctor objected. They used certain protocols to make sure they weren't found. One of them was about power consumption at the warehouse. For the last 100 years or so, the power companies routinely monitored for properties which consumed too much power. It was a holdover from previous times when that information could be used to find criminals and illegal hydroponic operations. Producing the Nomu consumed a lot of power. That's why they were set up in a warehouse in a factory area. The power consumption was higher than normal, but they still had to be careful. Take it slowly. No one can alter the records? Garaki asked. The question was directed towards Hisashi's contacts. Still climbing the ladder, All for One replied. Another year or 2, I imagine. The doctor nodded. He had no idea who Hisashi was referring to, but he knew that it would be someone All for One had helped. Whoever they were would have been directed to go into employment with a power company. Compared to a politician or a police person, it seemed such a waste, but it was just as important in the long run. Not every job was large, but the smallest could determine their success or failure. Have you had a chance to find assistants? Hisashi asked. There are 2 who appear to have the required disposition, Garaki reported. The policy of segregation that Izuku's school indulged in continued into middle school, and the teachers and other students made it very clear that they considered the quirkless students to be consuming resources better spent on those with a quirk. They also made it clear that it would be very difficult for those quirkless students to find a position in a high school. The high school that serviced Izuku's elementary and middle school openly admitted that they did not allow quirkless students, and given that only elementary and middle school were compulsory, there was not a lot of recourse for the quirkless students except to try enrolling somewhere else, or trying to find a job. Humans were so foolish. But right at the moment, it was to their advantage. Some of the quirkless students just accepted it. Others were angry. Either way, they did not care for society or those with quirks, and when offered a job that came with a chance for some revenge, there were several he felt had the right attitude to actually see it through. Despite what some of them had been through, Garaki felt they were still too soft. And the registry search? There's something in Seem-chan, he replied. Russia? All for one murmured. Their quirk registry is not as comprehensive as China's, but it is functional. Kyudai explained. Hisashi nodded. When you return, Gigantamakia, you will collect that one as well, he instructed. The huge man again looked like he would object, but he nodded. Now then, All for One said. To work. Izuku ate his lunch at his desk. He was alone today, and while he knew it was only going to be for one day, he missed his friends. Ochako had something on for her family. She'd been apologetic but not clear, and Hitoshi had a summer sniffle and was tucked up in bed at home. It was only for a day, so he told himself he shouldn't be lonely. He could handle one day. Surreptitiously he pulled out his phone. Even though he was 10, they were still not allowed to use them at school. Even so, he could see that Kawaguchi was playing a game on hers. He tapped into messages and went to Himiko's chat. Why was the red blood cell banned from church? He sent the question to her. He hoped she had her phone. Niigata Elementary had a slightly different policy. Students were allowed to use their phones in the breaks, but Himiko didn't always have hers with her. He watched the chat for a few moments, waiting for a reply. They'd worked out a system with jokes. You didn't deliver the punchline until the other person had replied. Izuku sighed, taking another bite from his bento. It appeared today was one of those days Himiko didn't have her phone. He sighed and slipped his phone back into his bag. He ate the last few pickles left in his bento and put the lid back on as well. Izuku was tying the furoshiki back when he heard a couple of the other students get up from their lunch. He thought nothing of it until someone blocked the light. They didn't move. The sympathizer is all alone today. Izuku recognized the voice. Gatarui. He looked up at the spider-quirked boy with a sense of dread and resignation. He knew how these encounters went. He'd experienced that in Niigata and Saitama. He wasn't interested in having it happen again. May I help you, Kumu? He asked politely. That seemed to surprise them for a moment. Gataru's face clouded, though it was difficult to see with his mutation. Then the spider-quirked boy slammed his hands on Izuku's desk. The gray-haired, today's color, boy noted absently that Kumu's mutation had extended to his hands. They were a dark color, almost as if chitin was forming on them. Izuku was sure they hadn't been like that a few years back. Don't act so high and mighty, Gatarui demanded. I'm not, Kumu, Izuku objected. You are, Arata spat. The other boy was standing to the side of Gatarui. He knew how this was going to play out. I'm sitting eating lunch, Izuku commented, tucking his covered bento box back under his desk. It was best to get it away before they decided to steal or break it. Sitting, thinking of new ways to sympathize. Gatarui growled. If Ochako or Hitoshi was here, Izuku knew the other two boys wouldn't be here. They must have been waiting for an opportunity. Had they confronted Ochako last year, when he wasn't here? Yeah, but he's weak, just like his little friend, Arata told Gatarui. That answered Izuku's question. What had Ochako gone through? What do you want? He asked, holding back a snarl. Oh, the sympathizer has some spirit. Gatarui laughed. And I bet you want to prove something, so come on. You and me, after school. What? Izuku didn't get it. Fight me, the spider-quirked boy said. After school today. Unless you're so powerless all you do is whine. Gatarui laughed. Yeah, like Uraraka. Arata chuckled. For a moment, Izuku saw red. Fine, he snarled. 4 o'clock, Gatarui snapped. Be there. He walked away. Arata paused for a moment, giving him a superior look before the other boy followed. That was stupid. Izuku didn't recognize who spoke. He looked up to see Betsu Dokusei looking at him. What do you mean? He asked when the two boys were out of the classroom. Betsu snorted at him, as if wondering why he was asking. Gatarui has been itching for a fight with you since last year. Why? That didn't make sense. Why would Gatarui want to fight him? You're not serious? Betsu gasped. Izuku nodded. The question was serious. He really didn't know. Oh man, she huffed and said something more under her breath that Izuku didn't catch. You might have noticed that Gatarui is bigger than you? Yes, Izuku agreed. Kumu, even at 10, had a large build. His shoulders were wide, and his body was solid. You might further have noticed that Kumu, despite being a 6th year, is bigger than most of the 7th years, Betsu continued. Since Ajimi left, he's been picking fights with everyone. Izuku blinked at that. He hadn't noticed it. You're the best in our year level at sports, both speed and strength. He doesn't like that. Izuku groaned. He got it now. Gatarui was another Setsuna. Especially since he's been training in karate since he was 5, Betsu finished. What? That could be a problem. Oh, don't worry, he hasn't taken it seriously, she retorted, waving one hand dismissively. He knows a couple of moves and thinks is Jackie Chan. Who's that? Look him up later. Betsu grumbled, annoyed that her joke had fallen flat. It wasn't funny when you had to explain. Izuku groaned again, and put his arms on his desk as he slumped over. Thank you, he said to Betsu, though the words were sort of muffled. He didn't see the way she grinned at him. I'm kind of looking forward to it, she told him. Probably everyone who had noticed was looking forward to it, Izuku realized. He huffed to himself. He could not show up. He hadn't really made the challenge, but he knew if he did that, then Kumu would think he'd won. And then he'd be insufferable. He had to show up, but he didn't have to fight. No. That wouldn't work either. Gatarui would beat him up anyway. Which meant he had to go and fight. He could use his quirks. That would be easy, but inwardly Izuku grumbled. If he used any quirk other than fire breath, that would cause attention, which would then be written up officially, which would then bring the heroes. He couldn't do that. Or at least, he couldn't use anything other than fire breath and against someone who knew how to fight. Darn it. He knew how to punch. Kurogiri had taught him that, but the Misty Man hadn't taught him how to do anything more. Though, Izuku supposed he could dodge well. Training with Tomura ensured that. If Gatarui hadn't taken his own training seriously, it might be enough. Wait. He had regeneration. That was passive. Izuku felt his stomach sink. He actually felt sick. How was he going to hide that? He was going to have to dodge. A lot. And if he took a hit, it couldn't be one that cut. He could pretend to get bruises. They didn't form immediately. He hoped. Izuku trembled slightly. He was going to ask Kurogiri to teach him to fight. Then in the future he wouldn't have to deal with this problem. Despite what Betsu had said, Izuku was rather thankful there were only a few spectators. He silently gave thanks to after-school activities and everything else that meant people couldn't be here. He briefly wondered where the teachers were, but he knew they would only get involved if they were going to be impacted. Gatarui was here, as was Arata. There was a small group of other students around them. Betsu was off to the side, and Izuku thought she was standing with Psycho Gasei, but he wasn't sure. It didn't matter. It was still sunny and Izuku looked up at the blue sky briefly. He enjoyed the light and the energy it gave him. Solar force was nice. It took the edge of a long day at school. At least until the sun went down. All right, Izuku said. Let's get this over with. Ha! Gatarui snorted. You act like you're going to win, the other boy growled. We'll see, Izuku shrugged, downplaying the situation. He knew enough to know that if he believed he was going to lose, he would. He wasn't going to lose. The spider-quirked boy shook his head. Oh, you're gonna be in so much pain. Over what? Izuku asked, giving him a look that clearly said he really didn't think much of Kumu's intelligence. He probably shouldn't be provoking him, but he wanted everyone to know whose stupidity this was. Don't try to talk your way out of this, sympathizer. He growled. Let's do it. Izuku sighed visibly and then rolled to the side as Gatarui threw a punch that even without any training, he saw from a mile off. He had the good sense to step back before the other boy swung back round so that when Kumu lashed out, Izuku was out of the way. Gatarui spun to confront him. He clicked his mandibles and charged again. Izuku dodged to the side, but at the last second, Kumu's hand shot out, and he clipped Izuku in the chest. "Oof," he gasped. "Ha!" The other boy laughed. It stung for a moment, but Izuku felt regeneration take care of the bruise. He was thankful that solar force replenished his energy, though, as he remembered how tiring regeneration could be. Probably not on that little hit, but if something more happened. But if that's what Gatarui wanted, then Izuku would play. He brought up his fists. Even without his strength quirk, he knew he wasn't too weak. The difference between them came from their builds. Gatarui was solidly built. Izuku was comparatively slender and light. If he was going to inherit his dad's build, he had a lot of growing to do. "Ha ha ha." Kumu laughed. "You're actually going to try to fight?" he asked as he fell into a fighting stance. Izuku didn't recognize it but figured it was from his karate training. He waited. He really wished he knew what to do now, but Izuku knew if he threw a punch then he'd be open to retaliation. His best chance was to wait for Kumu to present him with something and hope he was fast enough to react. Mentally, Izuku was making a list of quirks which would help him. Speed was high on the list. If he just wanted to take damage, then regeneration was enough, but that wasn't a good idea. Kumu jabbed, but Izuku could see that it would be short. "You've actually got to reach me, you know," he taunted. That led to a follow-up kick. Izuku saw it coming but didn't know how to block it. He moved his hands, trying to catch the blow, and he somewhat succeeded but was pushed back and unbalanced. The time gave Gatarui the opportunity to lower his leg and jab at him. Izuku tried to dodge, but he just pushed himself even more off balance and he felt himself fall. Instinctively he tucked up and then rolled. He remembered well enough that he couldn't let Kumu kick him when he was down. That's how his rib got broken. Thankfully the larger boy didn't seem to want to do that, and Izuku sprung up, and just managed to dodge a follow-up kick. He took a deep breath and thought about his options. 1. He could let Kumu beat him up. It would hurt, but he'd heal. Except that would mean that Gatarui thought he was better than him. It wouldn't really mean it, but the other boy obviously equated physical prowess to worth. No, he wasn't going to accept that. 2. He could run away. He didn't have a speed quirk, but he was pretty sure that he was faster than Gatarui. The chitin that was his head had to be heavy, and Izuku wasn't sure if he could breathe with the same efficiency. No, that wasn't an option. It would almost be worse than letting himself get beaten up. So 3, he could fight, and let regeneration heal the damage. Inwardly Izuku nodded to himself. Unless he stood up to Kumu, and actually showed the other boy that he wasn't going to be pushed around, then this would happen again, or there'd be that stupid superiority. For a moment, he let himself contemplate option 4. He could take Kumu's quirk. He wasn't sure what would happen if he took a mutation-type quirk, but... No. That wasn't an option. He couldn't. He could, but there were people watching. They'd know, and that would go on record, and... No, he wasn't going to do anything to endanger his dad. Right, option 3 it was. Izuku braced himself and waited for Kumu to swing at him. He didn't have to wait long. Apparently Gatarui was annoyed that he hadn't stayed down. The punch impacted on his ribs as Izuku didn't try to defend. Instead he threw his own punch back. He hit chitin and felt his knuckles sting. He knew what it felt like to hit the punching bags, but this felt different. The sting was quickly gone, as was the pain from his ribs. He swung again because Kumu hadn't drawn back. Gatarui gasped as Izuku's punch hit him a second time. He leapt back, and Izuku cocked his head, as if inviting another round. Izuku was very tempted to say he could do this all day, which was actually true, so long as there was sunlight. He could go on, but he knew that wouldn't help. Run! Kumu growled at him, trying to make him seem weak. Izuku remained silent, holding his stance. The other boy yelled and charged forward again. This time, Izuku threw his punch first. He hit Kumu on the chin and winced as his knuckles impacted on one of Gataru's mandibles. The other boy flailed at him and Izuku's head was rocked back as he was hit. He took a few steps backwards and huffed audibly. "I'm not going to run, Gatarui. I'm not going to give up. And we can continue hitting each other, but I won't be changing to what you expect." "And you won't be changing to what I expect," Izuku said, checking his hand to see if he'd cut it. He didn't think he had, because while regeneration was fast, it wasn't that fast. I don't want you to change. You act all high and mighty. You think you're better than us. So what? Izuku frowned. You just want to beat me up? The spider-quirked boy screamed and charged forward rather than answering. It was pathetically easy to sidestep him and stick out one leg to trip him. He actually sprawled in the dirt for a little. I'm out of here, Izuku said and turned away. There was a notable silence from the spectators and even Arata said nothing as Izuku walked away. Thankfully no one followed. When Izuku was out of sight he sighed heavily. Gatorui would want a rematch. He could avoid it for a while but not forever. And if he had to fight Kumu again, then he needed some way to cover up the fact that he had regeneration. He had to learn to fight. Who could teach him? Now that he thought about it, Kurogiri was already teaching him how to use his quirks and he'd never seen the Misty Man fight. Which really only left Gigantomachia. Izuku had never seen the giant fight but he knew he had to be able to. Izuku nodded to himself. He'd ask tonight. He had a feeling he'd need the knowledge sooner rather than later. End the Emperor's Dragon, Fledgling, Chapters 5 and 6. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.